Bismillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Lahu ni'matu wa lahul fadlu, wa lahu thana'ul hasan, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Habibina wa Maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I ask Allah, the Exalted, to grant us all the sincerest of intentions, the ability to understand and do good, and the reward in the hereafter. Insha'Allah, in today's lesson, we are going to review together some of the blessings and the opportunities that are available to us in the blessed month of Dhul Hijjah, and also in particular talk about the Udhiyah or the Qurbani sacrifice. As you know, the months in the Islamic calendar, they are 12. The first of them is called Muharram, and the last of them is called Dhul Hijjah. The best day of the year is the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, and it is known as the day of Arafah, because this is the day in which the people who are performing the Hajj pilgrimage, they all gather together in a place called Arafah, close to Mecca. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said in a hadith narrated by Abu Dawood in his Sunan, Al-Hajju Arafah, that is the greatest integral of Hajj is being at Arafah. This is a day on which the Muslims from east to west, from different races, ethnicities, cultural heritages, speaking different languages, people of different social standing, kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, all of them gather together on the plains of Arafah, seeking to worship Allah alone, seeking forgiveness for their sins that they have done in the past. All of them standing as equals, and the only thing differentiating them, their piety. That is, all of them united in the worship of God alone, chanting the dhikr, Labbaik Allahumma Labbaik, Labbaik la sharika laka Labbaik, Innal hamda wa ni'mata laka wal mulk, la sharika lak. This means, O Allah, I obey your order. I obey you one time after the other. O Allah, I obey your order and there is no partner with you. You are the one who deserves to be praised and thanked. Every endowment is from you. You are the one attributed with dominion. There is no partner with you. All the Muslims united in worshipping Allah alone, the one who exists without a beginning and without an end, the one who is free of need, and the one that we are all in need of. The start of the lunar months is determined by either seeing the new moon after the 29th day or the completion of 30 days, in the case in which the new moon was not sighted. These are important rules for us to learn about, because if we are to benefit ourselves from the blessings that are available in the days of Dhul Hijjah, then clearly we need to know, when does this month actually begin? When is the day of Arafah? I mean, we said this is the best day among the days of the year, the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. How would we know when is the 9th of Dhul Hijjah if we did not learn what are the religious rules by which we can know when does a particular lunar month start and when does it finish? This is a topic that we have reviewed in other lessons, but here I'm just going to touch upon it in brief. So let us briefly review some rules of the religion pertaining to sighting the new month. In the northern hemisphere, the new moon, it looks like a backward C. So you put your right hand in front of you, and the shape that actually forms, that is the shape of the new moon. As for in the southern hemisphere, the new moon actually appears like the old moon for the people in the northern hemisphere. But those are details for another lesson. So the new moon for the people in the northern hemisphere, that is like a backward C. So I extend my hand out and I look forward. That is the shape of the new moon. So from where you would be actually looking, that's how the new moon would appear. And the old moon would appear like a C shape. So if I look ahead at me and the new moon was ahead of me, that's how it would actually appear. So for yourselves, it would appear something like that. So going back to the slide, you can see here images for the new moon and the old moon. The new moon being similar to a backward C and the old moon being like a C shape. Thereafter, Al-Bukhari, Muslim and others, they narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Inna ummatun ummiyya, la naktubu wa la nahsub, ashahru hakadha wa hakadha, يعني مرة 29 ومرة 30." This means that indeed we are an ummah, a nation that does not write or calculate to know the end of the month. The month is either like this or it is like that, i.e., it is either 29 or 30 days. Therefore, in summary, it is not permissible to rely upon calculations. One either cites the new moon or relies upon the testimony of other trustworthy, knowledgeable Muslims. If one does not know of sighting of the new moon after the 29th day, then one completes 30 days of Dhul Qa'dah. In other words, after 29 days have actually passed, you go to look for the new moon after the sun has set. If you see the new moon, it means that the new month has started. And if you do not see the new moon, for example, because it is cloudy, then in that situation, you complete 30 days of the present month and the following day would be the first. So as I said, these are rules that we need to learn so that we can ensure that our acts of worship are valid. We are doing them in the proper way in compliance with the rules of the religion. Thereafter, even though some people are unable to go to Hajj and receive the great reward associated with it, Allah, by His great mercy and generosity, He enabled those who were not able to get to Hajj to benefit from those great rewards. He granted them an opportunity of acquiring a lot of mercy and forgiveness wherever they actually might be on the earth. And in this year in particular, when certain restrictions have been placed on people traveling to other countries, and people have been prevented from going and fulfilling this obligation, going and imitating the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in fulfilling the acts of Hajj in the city of Mecca, the city in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born and raised, the city in which he spent 53 years of his life. Nonetheless, as I said, even though this is something which is a great deprivation for the Muslim Ummah to be prevented from visiting that honorable land, nonetheless we can still acquire a large amount of reward wherever we might actually be on the earth. That is in particular doing good deeds during the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. And it is a sunnah mu'akkada, a highly emphasized sunnah, to fast during the first 9 days of Dhul Hijjah, and in particular on the 9th day itself, that is the day of Arafah. So throughout these days, one should put extra effort to do good deeds such as fasting, giving in charity, attending religious lessons, and doing dhikr, among other such good deeds. A person does not know whether next year we will get an opportunity similar to this one. For example, recently we had the blessings of witnessing the month of Ramadan. How many people were alive in the previous Ramadan but who are not alive this Ramadan? And how many among them were alive this Ramadan but who are no longer with us and thus will not be able to witness the coming Ramadan? And we might also be among them. Allah knows best whether we will get to witness the month of Ramadan again. Now similarly, the blessings that are found in the month of Dhul Hijjah, we do not know whether we will be alive to witness it. And if we witness it, we do not know if we will get this opportunity in the following year. So a person should, for example, try to sleep early and put extra effort to wake up for the Fajr prayer and to perform dhikr and to also perform the Fajr prayer in congregation to get that extra reward. Likewise, a person should put extra effort to attend religious classes and do other good deeds during these blessed days, as though these are our last opportunities potentially before the soul exits our bodies. Among the beneficial things to do in this blessed month is to sacrifice an animal for the sake of Allah. And this is something that we're going to talk in a bit more detail now in the remainder of this lesson. This sacrifice in Arabic, it is known as al-Udhiyah. And in some cultures, in Urdu and Punjabi, it is referred to as the Qurbani, a sacrifice that is made for the sake of Allah. And it is defined as slaughtering a specific animal on specific days for the sake of Allah. Remember, Allah does not need our worship and is not benefited by any good deed that we do. But rather, we are the ones that are benefited by the good deeds that we do in compliance with the rules of the religion sincerely for the sake of Allah. So this is a highly rewardable act, as is evidenced by many different sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Among them, what Al-Hakim narrated in his Mustadrak, that Zayd ibn Arqam radiyallahu an, he said, قُلْنَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ مَا هَذِهِ الْأَضَاحِي. That is, we said, O Messenger of Allah, what is this Udhiyah? قال صلى الله عليه وسلم سنة أبيكم إبراهيم. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, it is the sunnah of your father Ibrahim. قال قلنا فما لنا منها. This companion, he said, we said, O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what reward do we get from doing it? قال صلى الله عليه وسلم بكل شعرة حسنة. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he replied, a reward for every hair of the sacrificed animal. قلنا يا رسول الله فالصوف. قال صلى الله عليه وسلم فكل شعرة من الصوف حسنة. The companion then asked, O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what reward is there for sacrificing animals that have wool? The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied, for every fiber of the wool there is a reward. Allah knows best, but it is said that the average human being has around 5 million hairs on their body, around 100,000 on their heads, and 4.9 million scattered throughout the rest of the body. And as is evident, a sheep and a goat, they have a lot more hair or fibers on their body than the average human being. So you can see that there is an opportunity to acquire a very great reward. And from what's apparent, millions of hasanat. As I said, the average human being has around 5 million hair follicles on their body. An animal such as a goat has a lot more than that. So from what is apparent, this is an opportunity to spend a small amount of money to follow not just the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also the sunnah of Prophet Ibrahim, and acquire through it millions of hasanat, millions of rewards. And in some narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is mentioned that this is not just an opportunity to acquire a large amount of reward, but it is also a means to acquire a great forgiveness, a large amount of forgiveness for the sins that one might have committed prior to that. And remember once again, the meaning of sacrifice is ultimately to give up something of value for something of greater value. One of us might, for example, give 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 or 100 pounds, depending upon where they are actually having an animal slaughtered. In some countries, the animals are money, and therefore it is often easier and cheaper to sacrifice an animal within that country. In some other countries, the Muslims might be in greater need, and it might be more expensive to pay for an animal to be slaughtered for the sake of Allah in that other country. But the reward comes also along with our efforts. The more effort that we put, the more sacrifice that we make, the greater our reward. This is why in a hadith narrated by Imam An-Nasa'i, once the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that a dirham, it went ahead of 100,000 dirhams. And the companions, they asked, how would that be, O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How would it be that one coin gets ahead, gets a greater reward than 100,000? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he explained that a particular individual, he only had 2 coins, and he gave one of them for the sake of Allah. As for the other person, he had many hundreds of thousands, and he donated 100,000, but they did not bring for him the reward of the one who donated that one single coin, because the sacrifice that he had to make was greater. Because as we said, to sacrifice means to give up something of value to you, something that is dear to you, sincerely for the sake of Allah. And we get opportunities throughout the year of different types of sacrifices, but reflect upon it. How often do we get to sacrifice an animal, this living creation that has a soul inside it, that will actually experience a certain amount of pain? And sometimes, especially if you have an animal that you are owning for a period of time, you might even actually develop a certain attachment to it. But then you sacrifice it for the sake of Allah, giving out the meat to the people who are poor, those in need, but also separate to that, eating from it yourself, as we'll come on to explain, and giving it as a gift to others. Because giving gifts is actually a means by which a person can increase the love that you have between yourself and your fellow Muslims, and that in its own right is a great blessing from Allah the Exalted. So let us say a bit more then about the issue of sacrificing animals to fulfill this sunnah and to fulfill the wajib according to some of the scholars. Now, in the rules that I'm going to review in the slides that follow, in general, I'm going to focus on the Hanafi school. One of the reasons for that is that because according to the Hanafis, this act of worship is actually wajib upon a certain number of individuals. That is, if they satisfy particular conditions, it is an obligation upon them to do it. Not doing it would actually be sinful. And I will at the same time reference some details in reference to the school of Imam Shafi'i. Even though these are not the only 2 madhabs, I estimate that most of the people who will be listening to this particular lesson, they will either be following the Hanafi or the Shafi'i school. So in the Hanafi madhab, the Hanafi school, the school taught by Imam Abu Hanifa radiyallahu an, in compliance with the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, offering a sacrifice during a specific time is wajib upon any pubescent Muslim, male or female, who is solvent, i.e. religiously they are not considered poor. And it is more specifically defined as for whom it is wajib, an obligation to pay sadaqatul fitr, okay, or zakatul fitr. That is a Muslim who owns the nisab above their debts, above their food, clothing, accommodation, furniture, and other such personal basic needs, along with the basic needs of those whom they are obligated to support. And the nisab is defined as the one who actually owns 200 dirhams, that is 200 silver coins, each coin weighing approximately 2.97 grams. That is a total of around 600 grams. And according to the present day prices of silver, that's roughly around 300 pounds. In other words, the one who owns 300 pounds above their basic needs, that is their debts, their food, clothing and accommodation for themselves and those people that they are obligated to support, such as their wife and children, then such a person, in the rules of Islam taught by Imam Abu Hanifa, they would not be considered a poor person. They are considered somebody who is solvent. They have enough to take care of their basic needs and something on top of that. For such a person, if they are free and they are a resident, so they are not a slave and they are not a traveler, all right? If they were a traveler, then it would not be wajib, it would not be an obligation for them to fulfill the Udhiyah, the Qurbani sacrifice. However, the person who is doing Hajj in a way that they are doing the Hajj that is known as the Hajj of Qiran or Tamattu', that is, they are combining between Hajj and Umrah, which is the Qiran, or they are doing an Umrah followed by the Hajj, which is known as Tamattu', then such people actually it is wajib upon them to sacrifice. But the one who is doing the Ifrad type of Hajj, so they are referred to as a Munfarid, such a person, it is not wajib upon them. That is, those who are at Hajj and who are doing Hajj by itself, all right? They did not do Umrah before it, and nor are they combining a Hajj and Umrah in one. There is a particular way in which you can do Hajj such that it would count as a Hajj and Umrah in one. So if you're not doing Hajj like that, you're doing the Hajj that is known as the Hajj of Ifrad, then such a person who is considered a traveler, so they traveled to Mecca and the surrounding lands to fulfill the acts of worship, for those people it is not wajib, all right? It's not an obligation for them to do the Udhiyah, but it is sunnah. It is recommended for them to do it. Thus, in brief, if you are a traveler, it is not an obligation upon you. If you are a child, it is not an obligation upon you. If you do not have enough money to take care of your basic needs, and actually over and above your basic needs, you do not own the nisab, which is approximately 300 pounds, that is 200 dirhams or 600 grams approximately of silver, then it is not an obligation upon you to do this act of worship. Otherwise, if you fulfill the conditions and you neglect doing it, not only would you be depriving yourself of this great reward and a large amount of forgiveness, you would actually be sinful. Now, in the Shafi'i madhab, the school that was taught by Imam Shafi'i radiyallahu an, in compliance with the Quran and the Hadith, he had a difference in opinion. And that is because the scholars, the top qualified scholars, the mujtahid scholars, sometimes they had different interpretations for the religious texts. That is, some texts, some scholars interpreted them to mean that this act of worship is highly emphasized and we are highly encouraged to do it. But if you don't do it, you're not sinful. And other scholars said it's not only just highly recommended or highly encouraged, but rather it is actually an obligation. It is wajib to do so. So Imam Shafi'i radiyallahu an, he said that the Udhiyah is an emphasized sunnah, that is a sunnah mu'akkada. It is not a wajib. Moreover, he said it is actually a sunnah kifaya, a communal sunnah for the family. So if, for example, the father, he performs this act of worship on behalf of himself and the rest of the family, then the sunnah occurs for all of the family. So for the one who is financially able to leave performing this act of worship, it is disliked, it is makruh, but it is not sinful. Now, up to 7 people can actually be a partner in a camel or a cow, but a sheep or goat only suffices for one person. Although one sheep would fulfill the sunnah on behalf of an entire family, even if it was a large family. And the best animal to slaughter is a camel, then a cow, and then after that a sheep and then a goat. So although slaughtering 7 sheep is better than slaughtering 1 camel, and to slaughter a sheep is better than to be a partner in a camel or a cow, any of these are actually valid types of slaughtering, and each of them carries a reward. So the Udhiyah, with regards to its timing, in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, this sacrifice, it is made during the 3 days of sacrifice, i.e. from the Fajr of Eid al-Adha, i.e. the 10th day of Dhul Hijjah, which is known as a day of Nahr, a Yawmu Nahr, okay, a day of sacrifice. And its time remains until the end of the last day of Nahr, i.e. the sunset on the 12th of Dhul Hijjah. However, it is better to do the sacrifice on the first day. So these 3 days and 2 nights are referred to as the days of Nahr, sacrificing. And these should not be confused with the days of Tashriq, which are from the 11th, 12th and 13th of Dhul Hijjah. In other words, you have the day of Arafah, which is the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, which is referred to as being Yawmu Arafah. Then the day that comes after that is what? The 10th of Dhul Hijjah. And that is the day of Eid al-Adha. Then you have 2 days that follow that, the 11th and the 12th of Dhul Hijjah. And these are also days of Nahr, days of sacrifice according to the Hanafis. So the days of Nahr start on the day of Eid. So the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, the 11th and the 12th of Dhul Hijjah. These 3 days are referred to as days of sacrifice. And then you have the 13th of Dhul Hijjah, which is part of the days of Tashriq. In other words, the days of Nahr are 10, 11 and 12. And the days of Tashriq are 11, 12 and 13. So 11 and 12 are days of Nahr and days of Tashriq. Sounds quite complicated. Don't worry if you didn't catch all of that. In brief, for now, just remember that the day of sacrificing for fulfilling this wajib, it is during a specific time. When does that time start? It starts on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah and it ends on the sunset of the 12th of Dhul Hijjah. Now, in the school of Imam Shafi'i, the time of slaughtering, it starts after the lapsing, after sunrise, of the time it takes to pray the 2 rak'ahs of the Eid prayer and to give 2 short speeches after that. That is around 15 minutes after sunrise. And it is better to delay it for this period after the sun has reached the height of an Arabian spear, i.e. around 20 minutes plus this initial 15 minutes, so around 35 minutes after the sun has actually risen. So the time of slaughtering in the school of Imam Shafi'i, they define it as after sunrise, a certain time period has actually passed. What is that time period? The time it takes to perform 2 rak'ahs of the Eid prayer and to deliver 2, if you like, speeches. So after this time period has actually passed, that is when the time of this slaughtering starts. And it is actually better to delay it for this time period, not just after the sun has risen, but after the sun has risen to the height of an Arabian spear, which takes about 20 minutes. Okay, so this time that it takes to perform the Eid prayer, the 2 rak'ahs, and to deliver 2 speeches is around 15 minutes. So that's roughly around 35 minutes. It's better to delay it after that. And just to be clear, the Shafi'is don't say that you have to perform the Eid prayer yourself first of all before the sacrifice is performed. Rather, you have to wait for the time it takes to perform the Eid prayer along with the 2, if you like, short speeches before the sacrifice is performed. That is, whether you are performing it yourself or somebody is performing it on your behalf. So continuing back now then in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, the slaughtering, if done in a town where the Eid prayer is being performed, it needs to take place after the Eid prayer has been performed in at least one place in the town where the slaughtering is taking place. And it is makruh, disliked to do it before the Eid khutbah. If a pubescent person fulfills the conditions that we mentioned, even for a short period of time during the specified time, then it is wajib upon them to sacrifice. Now, the reason why the Udhiyah has to be done after the Eid prayer has been performed is because Al-Bukhari, Muslim and others narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he taught us by saying, Inna awwala ma nabda'u bihi fi yawmina hadha an nusalliya thumma narji'a fananhar faman fa'ala dhalika faqad asaba sunnatana wa man dhabaha qabla an yusalliya فإنما هو لحم قدمه لأهلي ليس من النسك في شيء. The first thing we do during this day of Al-Eid is that we pray the Eid prayer. Then we slaughter. The one who does that is following a sunnah in that. So the one who slaughters before praying is not fulfilling the sunnah of Udhiyah, but rather they are merely offering meat to their family. Thereafter, note, it is not permissible for the person who is observing this act of worship to sell any part of the sacrificed animal, even the skin, although one can eat from the animal and give a gift from it. In other words, there are rules in the religion pertaining to fulfilling this act of worship. There is a specific time in which you need to do it. And if you want to avoid falling into sin, then you need to do it in the way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam directed us to observe this particular act of worship. And likewise, if you want to, if you're following the saying of Imam Shafi'i that it is not wajib to fulfill this act of worship, it is just a sunnah, then you want to get the reward rather than falling into a makruh, which would either, for example, reduce or take away your reward. You want to do it in the way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught. In other words, a person prays or waits for the time that is it takes to perform the Eid prayer along with 2 speeches before actually carrying out this act of worship. That is, a person needs to learn a minimum amount of religious knowledge so that they would be able to take advantage of this opportunity to get a great reward and also forgiveness for their sins. So let us say a bit more about some of the rules of the Udhiyah. Among the conditions of the validity of the sacrifice is that the age of the animal has to be, if the animal was a camel, at least 5 years old. And if it is a cow, it should be at least 2 years old. And if it is a sheep or a goat, it should be at least 1 year old. And that is according to Imam Abu Hanifa in the Hanafi school. As for Imam Shafi'i, he said, yes, for the camel should be at least 5 years old and the cow should be at least 2 years old. But for the sheep, he said it should be at least 1 year old, and for the goat, it should be 2 years old. All right, so there is a difference there. For the goat, it should be at least 2 years old and not just 1 year old, according to the madhab of Imam Shafi'i. As to the animal, it should be an animal that does not have certain defects. I mean, this animal that a person is presenting as a sacrifice out of worshipping Allah, giving up something of value for something of greater value, then that sacrifice needs to be at a certain level. So the scholars, they said, for example, it should not be blind in one or both eyes. It should not have a limp which prevents it walking from its place to the place of sacrifice. And it should not be very skinny. And it should not have, for example, more than a third of the ear or tail cut off, or other such deficiencies worse than these aforementioned. So it's not just any animal. So for example, it's not just a chicken, all right? It is specific animals. And even those animals need to be at a certain age. So for example, if it was a 3-year-old camel, this would not suffice. If it was a 1-year-old cow, this would not suffice. If it was a 6-month-old sheep or goat, this would not suffice. Even though it has a value, for the validity, the animal needs to be of a certain age and it needs to be of a certain quality. So as we said, if it was blind in one or both eyes, this would not suffice for you to use this animal to fulfill this act of worship. The wajib would remain upon that person. And furthermore, the sacrifice, as we said, it should be made after the Eid prayer, such that if it is done before the Eid prayer, then it is merely a meat that would be actually being offered. It would merely be a slaughter, and that a person who does that, even though the animal, the meat is halal to eat, all right, it's a valid slaughtering, but it's not a valid udhiyah. It's not a valid qurbani. Such a person, they would still have upon them a qurbani that they need to offer. Thereafter, the integrals of al-udhiyah, they are two. Slaughtering a specific animal in the way that we've already mentioned, and thereafter the intention of al-udhiyah, the intention of qurbani. So a person needs to give 1 goat or 1 sheep for each person that it is an obligation upon them to fulfill this act of worship. Alternatively, one can be a partner in at least a 1/7 of a camel, cow, or a water buffalo. I mean, they can slaughter a camel. Just one person can do a camel for themselves, or a cow for themselves, or a water buffalo for themselves. Or they can be a partner with other people, that is 6 other individuals, 7 in total. They can be a partner in the slaughtering of a camel, cow, or a water buffalo. And the animal, it can be a male or a female. Hence, it would not be valid, as I said, to fulfill this act of worship. The wajib would not be fulfilled if, for example, a person sacrificed a chicken with the intention of qurbani. Now, yes, a person could take an animal like a chicken, slaughter it for the sake of Allah, distribute the meat to the poor and get reward for that. Okay, and they can eat from some of that meat of that chicken themselves as well. But for it to be considered a valid udhiyah, that is a valid qurbani, then it would not be accepted for them to slaughter a chicken in place of, for example, a sheep or a goat. Now, slaughtering, what does that mean? It means to cut the neck of the animal, fulfilling the rules of the religion. Ultimately, the neck is cut in a way that you cut the food pipe and the windpipe, if you like, along with the blood vessels on the sides. This is, if you like, the minimum that a person needs to do in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. As for in the school of Imam Shafi'i, even if those blood vessels were not cut, but you cut the food pipe and the windpipe, then it would be valid. As for the intention, then this is a firm conviction in the heart. And this should be to have the intention of doing the qurbani, doing the udhiyah as an act of worship. That is to sacrifice this animal seeking the reward from Allah alone, and not merely just to acquire the meat that you would get from the slaughtered animal. You're not just slaughtering this animal so that you would have some meat for yourself and meat to give out to the poor and meat to give out to your friends and relatives and the like, but rather it is to fulfill this particular act of worship, this sunnah of Prophet Ibrahim and sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thereafter, there are certain sunnah acts of al-udhiyah. Among them is to not cut your nails or your hair from the 1st to the 10th day of Dhul Hijjah. That is similar to what people who go to do Hajj also observe when they are in a state of ihram. So it is sunnah, it is recommended for the one who intends to do a qurbani or an udhiyah to not cut their nails or their hair. From which period? From the 1st day of Dhul Hijjah until the 10th day of Dhul Hijjah. And on the 10th day, to not eat anything until the slaughtering has actually occurred. So that is, you don't cut your nails or your hair from the 1st until the 10th day of Dhul Hijjah until the slaughtering has actually taken place. And on top of that, you don't eat anything until the slaughtering has actually occurred. That is, if you did, you wouldn't be sinful, but this is not in compliance with the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we should at every opportunity actually try to be and imitate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imitating the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not mean that we would have an equal status to or an equivalent status to, but rather we would be more submitting ourselves in the worship of Allah by imitating the best of creation, the one who was the most perfect in submitting himself to Allah the Exalted. Thereafter, among the recommended matters, which is a sunnah, if a person who is able, they are capable, they religiously know how to do it, is for them to slaughter the animal themselves with their own hands, okay, to slaughter by oneself, and to say and do what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do when he would be slaughtering an animal. And in this regard, there are many different sunnahs. So for example, to sharpen your knife, to not slaughter one animal in front of another animal, and then to face the Qibla yourself. And scholars mention different sayings, okay? This is among what the scholars said, and some said this is the stronger and more reliable saying with regards to what is better to do. So for yourself to face the Qibla and to face the neck of the animal also towards the Qibla, okay? And then to slaughter the animal quickly, all right, with this sharp knife, whilst saying Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, and to repeat this dhikr 3 times. Okay, to say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar whilst you are actually slaughtering. Now, some of the scholars, they said that if you actively, deliberately do not say the name of Allah whilst slaughtering, then that animal would not be halal to actually eat. And other scholars, such as Imam Shafi'i, they said it would be makruh, it would be disliked, but the animal would actually be halal to eat even in that particular situation. Thereafter, if one is unable to slaughter by oneself, one gives the animal to someone else who is able, and one witnesses the slaughter. So if you can't slaughter yourself, you tell somebody else to slaughter it on your behalf whilst you stand and observe the slaughtering taking place. And there are some other rules to do with authorization, which I'll come on to mention in the coming slides, insha'Allah. It is not valid to give the price of the sacrificial animal instead of actually slaughtering it. This is because in this issue, the sacrifice in itself is the objective. This is different to the issue of zakah, where money being given instead of the actual food would be valid, because its key aim is to aid and support the poor and the needy. So in this situation, if you just gave out money or just meat, right? You purchased some meat and you gave out meat, this would not be valid. Okay, it would not be valid. You need to have a sacrifice of an animal. Either you sacrifice it yourself or you authorize somebody to sacrifice that animal on your behalf. Now, among the further sunnahs is to eat from the meat of the animal that one has sacrificed. And it is also sunnah for one to give some raw meat as charity to the poor, and to store some of it for your family, and to give some of it as a gift to the solvent, even those people who are rich. Okay, your fellow Muslims, to give them some of the meat is something good, is something beneficial, because as I said before, sharing gifts, exchanging gifts, through that a love is actually exchanged with one's fellow Muslims. That is to do with the Udhiyah, and outside of this particular month of Dhul Hijjah and outside of this act of worship, to exchange gifts with one's fellow Muslims is something that is rewardable. Now, in the Shafi'i school, it is not valid to give cooked meat to the poor. It has to be raw meat. Also, if only the stomach and the skin are given to the poor, then this is not valid either. They have to be given some meat. Now, one can eat a third, give 1/3 as a gift, and a third as a charity to fulfill the sunnah. But it is better to only eat a few bites and to give more than 1/3 as charity. And the Shafi'is actually said that it is better to give all of the rest as charity. In other words, there are different sayings among the scholars. You can divide it into 3 parts, and you can actually do other than that. You can eat a bit of it, and you can give some in charity, and you can give, in fact, even all of it in charity if you so choose to do. And among the recommended matters, that which is preferable, that which is mustahab, is for the one who is sacrificing to give the skin of the animal in charity. Although take note, as I mentioned before, one may use it for yourself, but you should not sell it. And nor should you in fact use it to pay the slaughterer with it. That is, the person who is slaughtering the animal, for example, on your behalf, you may need to give them a fee. Now, you cannot give as the fee the skin of the animal. Rather, you need to give a separate fee to the person who is slaughtering for you on your behalf. As for the skin, either you use it yourself or you give it away in charity, and that is actually what is more preferred. It is mustahab. It is recommended for you to do that. Now let us say a bit more about authorizing a person to sacrifice an animal for you on your behalf. Now, in the school of Imam Shafi'i, this is an act of worship that you cannot do on behalf of another person without their permission. Therefore, you cannot do it on the behalf of a deceased relative. Why? Because you cannot take their permission for it. However, after doing a good deed similar to this, you can say, "Oh Allah, give the reward of this good deed to so and so person." Now, a person can either sacrifice the animal themselves or authorize another person to do this on their behalf. For example, one can say to another trustworthy person, "I authorize you to perform an Udhiyah, sacrifice, on my behalf, or a Qurbani on my behalf. And I also authorize you to authorize another person to do it if you wish. And they can also authorize another person if they wish, and so on until the sacrifice is completed. And I give to you, for example, £95 for what you are paying, and any extra amount of money can be used for the benefit of the Muslims." In other words, the sacrificial animal, it might cost £91.56. All right. So anything extra, you say this can be used for the benefit of the Muslims, and you might actually give £100 and it might cost £95, and you say anything extra can be used for the benefit of the Muslims. A person can slaughter one animal, or they can slaughter more than one animal for the sake of Allah. It's not that they just have to do one only, but to fulfill the wajib, it has to be, for example, at least one sheep or one goat. Now, if you authorize someone to buy a sheep and to slaughter it on your behalf, then some of the scholars, they said, this person, they cannot authorize another person to do that without first of all seeking your permission. And that's why this formula, it sounds a bit long, but it gets rid of this issue, if you like, because sometimes you might authorize somebody else to take care of the Qurbani, the Udhiyah, for you on your behalf, but they are not going to be the one who's actually going to be slaughtering it. They might authorize another person, and that person might authorize another person, and that person might authorize another person until the sacrifice is done. So when you are authorizing a person, it's better to get, if you like, address this issue, to say, I authorize you, and they can authorize another person, and they can authorize another person until the sacrifice actually gets done. So that takes care of this particular matter in a way that the act of worship would be fulfilled in compliance with the rules of the religion according to Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, and other than them. Thereafter, a person who is actually able should not delay, right? They should not delay sacrificing the animal beyond the time that is being specified for it. And if they did, whilst they were able to do so, then they would actually be considered sinful according to the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. And according to Imam Shafi'i, they would be doing something which is makruh and missing out upon a highly emphasized sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So at the same time, you do not have to do it on the first day, right? The day of Nahr, that is the day of the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, the day of Eid al-Adha. It is then permissible to delay the slaughtering of the animal to the third day, if there is an excuse such as rain. But delaying it beyond this point is not permissible. And according to the school of Imam Shafi'i, as we said, until the fourth day, that is until the end of the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. According to the Hanafis, you have until the end, the sunset of the 12th of Dhul Hijjah, and according to the Shafi'is, until the end of, that is the sunset of the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. Now, the Hanafis, they said, if one did not make the sacrifice in previous years, in which it was an obligation upon the person to do it, then rather than slaughtering an animal, they must give the price of a sacrificial animal in charity. As was stated in the book, the Hashia of Ibn Abidin, who was a Hanafi scholar. He said, the person must give its price to the poor who are entitled to receive zakah. The price of the animal will be that of the country where one pays the charity. Hence, if one intends to give the charity in another country, then one must ascertain the market price of a goat, for example, or a sheep in that particular country, and then give the money to those entitled to receive zakah in that area. The Udhiyah is not done on behalf of a deceased Muslim, but rather a person can do it on behalf of himself and gift the reward to the deceased Muslim. All right. This is something that is mentioned and well known in our religion, that a person can do good deeds and gift the reward of that good deed to a person who is alive and to a person who has actually died, right? And this is a great blessing, that it keeps a connection between the Muslims who are alive and who have actually died. That relationship from one point of view is ongoing. We have relationships with those who are alive and we benefit them and they benefit us. But also Allah, by His grace and mercy, He made the situation such that we can benefit the dead, and the dead, that is some of them, they can actually benefit us. As for us benefiting the dead, then this is for anybody who died as a Muslim, even if they were an enormous sinner, even if they committed many enormous sins and died without repenting of them, we can benefit them. We can perform the janazah prayer for them and seek their forgiveness and their mercy. We can do good deeds sincerely for the sake of Allah in compliance with the rules of the religion and ask Allah to give a similar reward to that dead Muslim. But of course, not for the person who dies as a non-Muslim, because for them, then there is no forgiveness. As for how the dead would benefit us, then Allah made the situation such that the pious people, Allah enables them to benefit us from their graves, such as the prophets, for example. They would make dua, they would make supplications for us from their graves, as a result of which we would be benefited, as is evidenced by many different sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, such as what was narrated by Al-Bazzar and others, that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, during my life I would benefit you, and after I die I would also benefit you. And among the ways that I would benefit you is I would supplicate to Allah to forgive you. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he continues to benefit us from his honorable grave by making dua to Allah, seeking our forgiveness. Now there are many other beneficial things that a person can do during these blessed days, and some of them which are actually an obligation to do. And inshallah, I'm just going to review them in summary and in brief, and you will get an opportunity within your localities to review them in more detail. So it is recommended to say the takbirat before the Eid prayer. Moreover, in the Hanafi school, after each fard prayer prayed in congregation in jama'ah, it is wajib for the men to say the takbirat of the Eid, which are Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Wallahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar walillahil hamd. Okay, so this is wajib to say for the men who are performing the fard prayers in congregation, and they are said for each of the fard prayers, starting with the Fajr prayer on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah until the Asr prayer of the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. The day of Arafah, the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, is the best day of the year, and it is sunnah for those who are not performing Hajj to fast this day. Imam Muslim at-Tirmidhi and others narrated from Abu Qatada that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, Shiyamu yawmi Arafah, inni ahtasibu ala Allahi an yukaffir as-sanata allati qablahu wa sanata allati ba'dah. This means, for the one fasting the day of Arafah, I ask Allah to forgive the sins of the year which precedes it and the year which comes after it. Now, Imam An-Nawawi, in reference to the above hadith, he said that this forgiveness could include the major sins. As for other scholars such as Al-Mullah Ali Al-Qari, he said that Imam Al-Haramain Al-Juwayni said that which is forgiven are the small sins. And this is the saying that Al-Qadi Iyad Al-Maliki also gave weight to. Although it is mentioned in some ahadith that doing certain good deeds other than performing the Hajj pilgrimage, this could be a means for the forgiveness of even some enormous sins. For example, in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is mentioned that the one who says the dhikr, Astaghfirullah alladhi la ilaha illahu al-hayyul qayyum wa atubu ilayh, that such a person, some of their enormous sins would also be forgiven. Nonetheless, fasting on the day of Arafah, it is a highly rewardable deed which also carries with it a lot of forgiveness, even if it is only the forgiveness of one's small sins. With regards to the sins of the coming year being forgiven, some of the scholars, they said that this is interpreted to mean that Allah would protect the person from committing sins during the coming year. And some scholars said that it means that Allah would endow this person with so much mercy and reward due to their fast that these would act as an expiation for the sins of the previous year and also for the coming year. And Imam Ahmad narrated in his Musnad that the most common dhikr that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say on the day of Arafah and Yawm Arafah on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah is La ilaha illallahu wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulku wa lahul hamd, biyadihil khair, wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. So this was the dhikr that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would say it most often on the day of Arafah. And Imam Muslim narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there isn't a day on which more people are saved from hellfire than on the day of Arafah. So think about it. On this blessed day, with so many blessings and opportunities, a person could be fasting, a person could be making dhikr, a person could be giving out in charity, attending religious classes, teaching other people on a day when there are so many blessings and the mercy of Allah descending and such a great opportunity to get forgiveness. So a person should not let such a day go by, except that they don't want to just do one deed. They want to do many good deeds. They want to teach religious knowledge. They want to learn religious knowledge. They want to be fasting. They want to be performing dhikr. in particular the types of adhkar that the Prophet ﷺ used to perform. And Imam at-Tirmidhi narrated in his Sunan that the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the best of du'as is the dua, the supplication that is made on the day of Arafah, because this is a day upon which Allah forgives many people many of the sins that they committed prior to that. And among the supplications to make on the day of Arafah is the dua of Imam Ali radiyallahu anh, that was narrated by Al-Hafiz Ibn al-Jawzi in his book Muthir al-Gharam, that our Master Ali radiyallahu anh, he said, Allahumma a'tiq raqabati minan nar wa awsi' alayya min ar-rizqil halal washrif anni fasaqat al-jinni wal-ins. This means, O Allah, save me from the fire of hell and expand my halal sustenance, my halal rizq, and relieve me from the enormous sinners among the jinn and the human beings. That is, a person should seek to have good company and not bad company, because this would have consequences not only for a person in this life but also in the next life. Thereafter, it is, yes, rewardable for a person to fast on the day of Arafah and the 8 days that preceded, that is on the 9 days of Dhul Hijjah. But it is makruh tahrimi, sinfully disliked in the Hanafi school, and haram according to the Shafi'is, for a person to fast on the days of Eid itself, that is the day of Eid al-Fitr on the 1st of Shawwal and on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, and also on the days of Tashriq, that is the 3 days that followed the day of Eid al-Adha, 11th, 12th and the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. And it is wajib according to the Hanafis for the men to perform the prayer of Eid according to the rules that they mention and to observe the sunnahs that they mention, such as performing ghusl, wearing one's best clothing, wearing perfume and the like. And on the day of Eid itself, to congratulate one's fellow Muslims by, for example, saying Eid Mubarak, and the person who hears that either replying back with the same words, i.e. Eid Mubarak, or for example saying Barakallahu fikum. So in other words, there are many opportunities that a person has within this limited life that we have, and we should try to do as many good deeds as we possibly can at the different blessed and honorable times throughout the year, each of them carrying, if you like, a special reward that we should not want to deprive ourselves because we are too busy taking care of our dunya, attached to our money so that we don't want to sacrifice, attached to occupying ourselves with that which we enjoy, watching TV, watching movies, playing this game or that game, rather than sacrificing our time trying to do dhikr, learn religious knowledge and teach it to others, remembering that at one point in time we will take our last breath and be no more. And on the day of judgment then, there are winners and losers. May Allah end our lives successfully and make us winners on the day of judgment and unite us in the highest gardens of paradise along with our loved ones. And Allah, the Exalted, knows best.